Abigail Carter buried the last of her father's cattle with her own 2 hands the morning a stranger collapsed against her fence post, starving, bleeding, and lying about his name. She didn't know he owned half the mountain behind her. She didn't know he'd chosen her doorstep on purpose. All she knew was a man was dying in her yard, and no one in this territory had ever shown her kindness first. If this story moves you, subscribe and stay with me until the very end, and drop the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The fence post gave out before the man did. Abigail heard it crack, that dry, tired snap of old wood finally surrendering. And when she turned from the grave she'd been standing over for the better part of an hour, she saw a stranger folded against the broken rail, like something the wind had blown in and forgot to carry further. She didn't scream. She'd buried her father 2 days past and cried until there wasn't a scream left in her. She walked. "Mister," she said, stopping a few feet off, shovel still in her hand, dirt still under her nails. "Mister, you hear me?" Nothing. Just the rise and fall of a chest under a shirt so torn it barely qualified as a shirt anymore, and a face burned raw by days, maybe weeks of open sky. She should have left him there. Every voice of sense in her head told her so. A woman alone, a stranger collapsed on her land, a debt already circling her homestead like a buzzard waiting on a slow death. She had no business dragging trouble through her front door. But her father had raised her different than that. "No one finishes a day face down in the dirt if I've got a roof to offer." She muttered more to herself than to him, and got her arms under his shoulders. He was heavier than his frame suggested, the kind of heavy that came from muscle, not fat, though right now that muscle hung loose and useless. She dragged him 3 full yards before he stirred, eyes cracking open to a color she'd later call the gray of a storm that hadn't decided yet whether it meant to break. "Ma'am," he rasped, "you oughtn't be touching me." "I oughtn't be doing a lot of things," she said. "Bury my pa with strangers, feed the last of my flour to a man I don't know, mortgage my future on a house that might not be mine come winter. Seems oughtn't doesn't carry much weight around here anymore." He tried to sit up on his own strength, and failed, and something in his jaw tightened, not from the pain she'd learn later, but from the shame of failing in front of her. "Name's Ethan," he said. "Ethan Walker." It wasn't a lie, not exactly. Just half of a truth worn thin enough to pass. "Abigail Carter," she said. "This is Carter land. Was my father's. His father's before that." She hooked an arm under Ethan's and hauled him up with a strength that surprised him, the kind of strength that came from a woman who'd been doing a man's work alone for longer than she'd admit. "Can you walk if I carry half your weight?" "I can walk," he said, though his knees argued otherwise the moment he tried. She got him to the porch steps and set him down hard enough that he grunted. "Sit," she said. "I'll get water." "Ma'am, I don't want to be trouble." "You're already trouble," she said, not unkindly. "Questions whether you're going to be the kind I regret." She brought water in a tin cup with a dent on one side, the same cup her father had drunk from every morning of her whole life, and watched Ethan's hands shake as he took it. He drank like a man who hadn't tasted water in days, and maybe he hadn't. She didn't ask. Asking meant caring, and caring meant a whole conversation she didn't have the strength for today. "You got people," she said instead. "Someone I ought to send word to." His eyes flicked to hers, quick, calculating in a way she almost caught almost before he buried it under exhaustion. "No, ma'am, no people." "Everybody's got people." "Not everybody," he said, and something in his voice made her stop pushing. She recognized that tone. She'd used it herself plenty of times when the truth was a door she didn't feel like opening for a stranger. "Where are you headed?" "Wherever there's work," he said. "I've done ranch work, fence work. I can break a horse if you need it, broke gentle, and I can break it hard if you need it, broke fast. I don't drink, I don't steal, and I don't ask for more than what I earn." She studied him a long moment, the split lip, the burn across his cheekbones, the hands that, despite everything, were not the soft hands of a man who'd never worked. Calloused, rope-worn. That much at least wasn't a lie. "I can't pay you," she said flat out, because pretending otherwise would only shame them both later. "Bank's got a lien on near everything I own that isn't nailed to the floor, and even some of what is. I've got a roof, and I've got food enough for two if we're careful, and that's the whole of what Carter Land can offer a hired hand right now." "That's more than I had an hour ago," Ethan said. "Reckon it is." She stood brushing grave dirt off her skirt in a motion that had become mechanical over the last 2 days. "Room's in the barn loft. It's dry. Come sundown, you eat at my table, not off some tin plate in the dark like a dog. I don't care how poor a house is, nobody eats alone under this roof while I've got breath to say otherwise." Something moved behind Ethan's eyes, then something she couldn't name because she had no reason yet to look for it. It wasn't gratitude, not only. It was closer to disbelief, the specific disbelief of a man who had spent a long time waiting to be told exactly that by exactly someone who had no idea who he was. "You don't know me," he said quietly. "Could be anybody. Could be trouble you can't afford." "Mr. Walker," Abigail said, and there was iron under the softness of her voice now. "I buried my father 2 days ago in that ground behind you, and the bank sent a man to my door yesterday morning to remind me I've got 60 days before they take everything he ever built. I have had every kind of trouble a person can have. A hungry stranger asking for honest work doesn't scare me. It's the men in clean suits I've learned to fear." The truth was, Ethan Walker owned more land than the bank that was threatening to take Abigail Carter's homestead had ever loaned out in its history. His ranch sat 2 valleys over, sprawling up into timberland so vast that men who worked it for a full season sometimes never saw the whole of it. Walker cattle grazed on grass that stretched clean to the horizon in 3 directions. Walker money sat in 3 different banks in 2 different territories. Gathering interest, nobody needed gathered. His name spoken correctly opened doors in cities Abigail Carter had never seen and would likely never see. He hadn't planned to lie about any of it. Not really. He'd ridden out from his own gate 11 days ago with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, and a hunger that had nothing to do with food. A hunger to know once and for all whether a single soul in this territory would treat him with kindness. If kindness cost them nothing and gained them nothing either. Because 3 years back, a woman named Louisa Hargrove had promised to love him until her last breath. Right up until the morning she learned his father's estate had been settled in someone else's favor over a legal dispute that made the Walker fortune look for 6 terrible weeks like it might collapse entirely. Louisa hadn't waited to see how the dispute resolved. She'd been gone before the ink dried on the first newspaper article married to a railroad man inside the year, and Ethan had spent every night since wondering if there had ever been a real woman under all that affection, or only a woman in love with what his name could buy her. The dispute had resolved eventually entirely in his favor. The fortune had never really been in danger, but something in him had broken clean through and no amount of money had proven capable of mending it. So he'd ridden out ragged on purpose. He'd let the sun do its work on his face, let his boots wear thin, let 11 days of hard travel turn him into exactly the kind of man the world tended to look past, or worse. He hadn't expected to collapse at a stranger's fence post. That part hadn't been planned. But lying there in her yard, half-conscious, listening to a woman who had every reason in the world to leave him, decide instead to drag him to her porch and offer him her last flower. Something in Ethan Walker, something that had gone cold and quiet 3 years ago, stirred for the first time since Louisa Hargrove rode out of his life in a rented carriage. He told himself it was only curiosity. He told himself he'd stay a week, maybe 2, long enough to satisfy the question that had been eating him alive, and then he'd ride home and put the whole thing behind him. He did not yet understand that Abigail Carter was not a question a man answered and moved past. She was the kind of answer that rearranged everything a man thought he already knew. Supper that night was thin biscuits made from the last of the flour, a strip of salted pork, split 3 ways, though there were only 2 of them, because Abigail set a 3rd plate out of old habit before catching herself and quietly putting it away. "Sorry," she said, not looking at him. "My father always—" She stopped. "Never mind." You don't have to explain grief to me, ma'am, Ethan said. I've buried people too. Your family. My mother. That much at least was fully true. Long time back. My father more recent. Also true, though the estate battle that had followed his father's death had rearranged Ethan's whole understanding of who could be trusted in ways he wasn't prepared to explain to a woman he'd known for 6 hours. Abigail nodded slowly, chewing on that answer the way she chewed on the biscuit thoughtfully without rushing. Then you know, she said. How a house gets loud with quiet after. I know it. They ate a while without talking, and the silence wasn't uncomfortable, which surprised them both. Bankman's name is Cornelius Pratt, Abigail said, eventually staring at her plate. President of Pratt National out of Millbrook. He came out here yesterday morning in a carriage clean enough you could see your face in the door handle, and he told me real polite, real gentle, like he was doing me a kindness, that my father's note was 90 days behind, and that the bank would need the full balance in 60 days, or they'd be forced to foreclose. Her jaw set hard. Full balance. $800. I don't have $8, Mr. Walker, let alone 800. Ethan's hands went still around his fork. $800 was less than what he spent on horseshoes in a bad month. Your father took the loan, he asked carefully. 3 years back. Drought hit us hard, lost near half the herd, needed money to hold the land through winter. Man named Pratt was real friendly about it then too. Real understanding. Didn't seem so understanding yesterday. Banks change their tune when the papers do. That's what my father used to say. Her voice caught just slightly on the word father, and she pressed her lips together until it passed. He fought that note for 3 years, worked himself sick trying to hold this place together so it'd still be Carter land when I inherited it. And then his heart just... She snapped her fingers soft. 2 days ago, out in the east pasture, I found him myself. I'm sorry, Ethan said, and meant it more than his careful, half-true story had any right to mean. Everybody's sorry, Abigail said, not bitterly. Just tired. Sorry doesn't pay a note. No, Ethan agreed. It doesn't. He thought in that moment of the leather satchel in his saddlebag, out in her barn, the one holding more cash than most men in this territory saw in 5 years of honest labor. $800 was nothing to him. He could ride to Millbrook tomorrow morning and end her entire crisis before noon. But if he did that, he'd never know the truth he'd come looking for. He'd never know whether Abigail Carter's kindness at that fence post had been about him, the man, or whether, like Louisa, the moment money entered the picture, everything about her would shift into something calculating and careful. He told himself he was protecting the truth. He didn't yet let himself consider that he might also be protecting his own broken heart from finding out too soon that even a woman like Abigail could be bought, because if she could, then there was no woman left in this world worth trusting. And Ethan Walker didn't know if he could survive learning that twice. I can work, he said instead. Fence needs mending. I heard it break under me this morning. I'll fix what I broke and more besides. I won't solve your banknote, ma'am, but I can make sure what you've got left doesn't fall apart around you while you figure the rest. Abigail looked at him a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her tired eyes. Why? She asked. You don't owe me anything. I dragged you off a fence post, gave you water and a biscuit. Man in your position, most would have kept moving, found a homestead with better prospects than mine. Ethan set his fork down. Ma'am, I've been a lot of places lately where doors got shut on me for looking the way I look right now. Dirty. Poor. Not worth the trouble. He met her eyes. You opened yours. I don't forget a kindness like that. Not ever. Something in Abigail's face softened just at the edges, like a door not fully open, but no longer fully closed either. Well, she said, standing to clear the plates. You'll earn your keep starting tomorrow then. Fence first. Then we'll see what else this place needs from a man who doesn't forget a kindness. The fence work started before the sun had properly cleared the ridgeline, Ethan out in the yard with a coil of wire and a post hole digger that had seen better decades working alongside a woman who he quickly discovered could outdig him if she set her mind to it. You don't have to prove anything, he said, watching her drive the digger into hard summer earth with a strength that belied her frame. Wasn't proving, Abigail said, not even winded. Just working. Difference between the two is provings for people watching. I do this every day whether anybody's here to see it or not. He believed her. That was the thing that kept catching him off guard. Every hour spent in her company revealed another layer of a woman who wasn't performing anything for anyone, who worked because the work needed doing, who spoke because the words were true, who hadn't yet, in a full day and night together, said a single thing that felt calculated for effect. Louisa had calculated everything. Every laugh, timed every touch, considered every soft word aimed at some outcome. Ethan had been too blind and too lonely to see, until it was far too late. Abigail didn't calculate. She simply was. "Where'd you learn ranch work?" she asked, straightening to wipe sweat from her brow, leaving a streak of dirt across her cheekbone that she didn't seem to notice, and he didn't mention. "My father's place," Ethan said, which was true enough. "Learned young. Fence, cattle, horses, all of it. You've got good hands for it. Careful. Some men just muscle a fence post in and hope it holds. You're setting it right deep enough it'll stand a hard winter. Fence that doesn't hold isn't worth building." "My father used to say the same thing," Abigail said, and there was warmth in it now, not just grief. "Said a man's word ought to be like a fence post set deep enough that weather can't move it." They worked through the morning in a rhythm that surprised them both, falling into an easy back and forth that required no performance, no pretense, except of course for the one enormous pretense sitting at the center of everything Ethan told her. Around midday, the sound of hooves and carriage wheels turned both their heads toward the road. "That's Pratt's carriage," Abigail said, and Ethan watched her whole posture change, spine straightening, jaw setting, the soft warmth of the morning replaced by something braced and wary. "You want me gone?" Ethan asked quietly. "Man like that might not take kind to a hired hand standing at your side." "I want you standing exactly where you are," Abigail said, surprising him. "I've done enough facing men like Pratt alone. Today I'd rather not." The carriage rolled to a stop at the edge of the yard, black and polished, entirely out of place against the dust and worn wood of the Carter homestead. Cornelius Pratt stepped down first, a heavy-set man in a suit too fine for a dirt road, with the kind of smile that never once reached his eyes. Behind him came a second man, Ethan recognized immediately, though he kept every trace of that recognition off his face. Silas Kane, foreman of the Broadmoor Cattle Company, whose owner had spent 2 years trying to buy up every scrap of struggling land in this territory, to expand his grazing empire. Including Ethan, now understood with a cold certainty settling in his gutland exactly like Abigail's. "Miss Carter," Pratt said, tipping his hat with a gesture so smooth it felt rehearsed. "Lovely afternoon." "Mr. Pratt," Abigail said, arms crossing. "You're a day early if you're here about the note. I've got 59 days left, not 58. Pratt's smile thinned, but held. "Just being neighborly, Miss Carter. Mr. Kane here represents a party with genuine interest in your land, a fair offer should things not work out with the bank. Thought it kindest to introduce you both now, rather than let matters get desperate later." Silas Kane stepped forward, eyes sweeping over the homestead with the flat, assessing look of a man pricing livestock. "Broadmoor Cattle would pay $400 for the full parcel," Kane said. "Cash, quick close, save you the indignity of a foreclosure notice nailed to your own front door, ma'am." $400, half of what she owed. For land worth, Ethan knew from a single glance at the water rights and grazing acreage closer to 2,000. "This land isn't for sale," Abigail said, voice flat and immovable. "Not for $400, not for 4,000. My father built this with his own hands, and I intend to keep it standing with mine." "Sentiment's a fine thing, Miss Carter," Pratt said, "but sentiment doesn't clear a note. 60 days isn't so long as it sounds, and I'd hate to see a young woman alone lose everything for want of a practical decision made in time." Ethan felt something hot rise in his chest, not on his own behalf, but purely sharply on hers. He kept his hands loose at his sides, his face carefully blank, the way a hired hand's face ought to be in the presence of important men. but every instinct in him wanted to step forward to end this entire performance with a single sentence, to tell Pratt exactly whose land bordered Abigail's to the north, and exactly how quickly that neighbor's money could crush a small-town banker's entire career if he pushed a grieving woman 1 inch further. He said nothing. He'd made his choice at that fence post, and a man's word, even a half-lie of a word, was still a fence post he intended to set deep. 60 days, Abigail repeated. That's what the note says. I'll have your money, Mr. Pratt, every dollar of it, before that clock runs out. Pratt's eyes flicked briefly to Ethan, a ragged hired hand standing silent at her shoulder, and something like pity crossed his face. The particular pity of a man who believed absolutely that this poor woman's situation was hopeless. I do hope so. Miss Carter, Pratt said in a tone that made clear he hoped no such thing. I truly do. The carriage pulled away in a cloud of dust, and Abigail stood watching it go, with her fists clenched at her sides until it disappeared around the bend. $400, she said mostly to herself, for everything my father built, everything he died trying to save. She turned to Ethan, and for the first time since he'd collapsed at her fence, he saw something crack in her composure. Not tears, not quite, but close to it, close enough that her voice shook. I don't know how I'm going to save this place, Mr. Walker. I truly don't. Ethan wanted more than he had wanted anything in 3 long years to tell her the truth right then. To tell her the note was nothing, that he could ride to Millbrook and clear it before the sun set, that Silas Kane and Broadmoor cattle would never trouble her again, once they understood whose land bordered hers. Instead, he said, We'll figure it, ma'am, 1 day and 1 fence post at a time. It wasn't a lie. But it wasn't the whole truth either, and the weight of that gap sat heavy in his chest as they turned back toward the half-mended fence, the sun climbing high and merciless over a summer that had only just begun to test them both. That evening, after another quiet supper, eaten mostly in the exhausted silence of hard labor, Abigail sat on the porch step, working a needle through a shirt collar, gone thin at the seam. Ethan's shirt, the one torn nearly through at the fence post, mended now with careful, even stitches. You didn't have to do that, Ethan said, taking the seat beside her close enough to be companionable, far enough to be proper. Man works my land. He oughtn't do it in rags. Abigail said simply, not looking up from the stitching. Besides, idle hands make idle minds, and idle minds start remembering things a body would rather forget. Like the bank. Like the bank. Like my father's chair sitting empty at that table. Like every single thing I've got to figure out alone now, when 2 days ago I had a father to figure it out with me. She bit off the thread and held the shirt up, inspecting the stitch line with a critical eye. There. Won't win any prizes, but it'll hold. Ethan took the shirt from her fingers, brushing hers for just a moment, and something passed between them that neither one named out loud. Not yet. Not with the sky, only just beginning to purple toward evening, and grief still sitting fresh in the house behind them. Miss Carter, Ethan said, can I ask you something plain? Plainer than a bank threatening to steal my land in front of my own house? Go ahead. Why'd you drag a stranger off your fence post instead of leaving him for the next rider to find? Man like Pratt would have stepped clean over me and not thought twice. Abigail considered the question a long moment, turning her father's old tin cup over in her hands. My father used to say a person's whole character shows in how they treat someone who can't do a single thing for them in return, she said finally. A stranger dying with nothing to offer, that's when you find out who a person really is, underneath all the manners and the Sunday clothes. I didn't drag you here because I thought you'd be useful, Mr. Walker. I dragged you here because leaving you would have made me exactly the kind of person Pratt and Kane are, and I'd rather starve on this land than become that. Ethan sat with that a long moment, the words settling into him with a weight he hadn't expected, cutting straight through 3 years of careful, guarded distance he'd built around his own heart. Louisa had never once asked what she could offer someone who had nothing to give back. Louisa had never understood the question existed. That's a rare kind of character, ma'am, he said quietly. Rarer than you know. It's just decency, Abigail said, standing, brushing off her skirt. Costs nothing, and it's owed to nobody in particular, And maybe that's exactly why so many folks can't be bothered with it anymore. She paused at the door, looking back at him, where he sat on the step shirt mended and held loose in his hands. Get some rest, Mr. Walker. Fence isn't going to finish itself, and neither is whatever fight's coming for this land. I've got a feeling we're only just getting started. She disappeared inside, and Ethan sat alone on the porch a long while, after watching the last light drain out of a sky gone the color of an old bruise, turning her words over and over, until they'd worn a groove in him he suspected would never quite smooth out. He thought of Silas Kane's flat-pricing eyes. He thought of Cornelius Pratt's rehearsed pity. He thought of $800, a sum so small to him it was almost obscene, standing between Abigail Carter and everything her father had built. And he thought with a clarity that startled him that whatever answer he'd come out here looking for, he had already found something far more dangerous than a simple truth about human kindness. He had found a woman he was beginning against every careful instinct 3 years of heartbreak had built in him to fall in love with, and he had built that entire beginning on a lie. He now had absolutely no idea how he was going to survive telling her. Somewhere out past the mended fence, an owl called once into the deepening dark, and Ethan Walker sat with his borrowed name and his aching chest, and understood with the particular dread of a man who has just realized the ground beneath him has already shifted, that this was no longer a question he could simply ride away from once it was answered. He was in it now, all the way in it. And 60 days had just become the shortest, most dangerous stretch of time in his entire life. The fence held through the night, and so did Ethan's resolve right up until sunrise, when Abigail's voice cut through the barn loft, calling his name with an urgency that had him on his feet before his boots were even laced. "Mr. Walker, Ethan!" He dropped down from the loft, 2 rungs at a time, heart hammering, half expecting Pratt's carriage or worse. Instead, he found her standing at the edge of the north pasture, staring at a gap in the tree line where 3 of her father's remaining cattle had pushed clean through a rotted section of fence he hadn't gotten to yet. "They're headed for the ravine," Abigail said, already moving skirt, hiked in one fist. "That drop's steep enough to break a leg, and I can't afford to lose one more head of stock, not one." "How many?" "3. And one of them's Bessie. She's carrying a calf due any week now." Ethan didn't wait for the rest. He was already running, and the fear in her voice did something to him that no amount of careful distance could hold back. He caught up to the nearest cow in the tree line, a rangy brown thing with wild eyes, and got a hand on her flank just as she bolted sideways toward the ravine edge. Abigail cut left drive her back toward the tree line. She didn't question the order. She simply ran faster than he expected, skirts and all, and came up on the cow's blindside, shouting and waving her arms, until the animals spooked back the direction they needed. Ethan grabbed a length of rope off the fence post, looped it fast, and got it around the cow's neck before she could bolt again. "2 more," Abigail called, breathless, already moving toward the second animal. They worked in a rhythm that required no words after that first exchange. Ethan, driving Abigail, cutting the 2 of them, moving like they'd done this together 100 times instead of one panicked morning. By the time they'd gotten all 3 cattle turned back toward the pasture, both of them were soaked through with sweat and breathing hard, and Bessie, the pregnant one, was lowing low and uneasy in a way that made Abigail's face go tight with worry. "She's close," Abigail said, hand pressed to the cow's swollen side. "Real close. Days, maybe less. You've done this before birthing. Every spring my whole life. But my father always—" She stopped, jaw-setting the way it did whenever grief snuck up behind her unannounced. "He always handled the hard ones, the ones that came breech. I've pulled calves before," Ethan said, which was true, though the calves he'd pulled had been on land worth more than this entire homestead, with 3 hired vets standing by in case anything went sideways. He didn't mention that part. "You won't be alone in it whenever it comes." Abigail looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her tired eyes. Gratitude, maybe, or the beginning of something that went beyond gratitude, though neither of them had a name for it yet. "Thank you," she said simply, "for running." Most hired hands would have stood there waiting on instructions. "Didn't seem like a morning for waiting," Ethan said, and left it at that because the truth that he'd run, because the fear in her voice had cracked something open in his chest he'd kept locked for 3 years, wasn't a truth he was ready to hand her yet. They finished the fence by midday, the whole stretch of it now set deep and true, and Abigail stood back to survey the work with her hands on her hips and something almost like pride breaking through the exhaustion on her face. "You do good work, Mr. Walker." "Ethan," he said. "Ma'am's fine for strangers. We've dug post holes together and near lost a pregnant cow off a ravine. Feels past strangers now." Something flickered across her mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough to be its cousin. "Ethan, then. And you'll call me Abigail. Miss Carter makes me feel like I'm being lectured by the Reverend." "Abigail," he said, and the name sat strange and warm in his mouth, like something he wanted to say again just to feel it a second time. They ate a midday meal of hard biscuit and the last strips of pork out under the shade of the porch overhang, and Abigail talked. Really talked for the first time since he'd arrived, about her father, about the homestead's better years before the drought, about a mother she barely remembered who'd died when Abigail was small. "What about you?" she asked eventually. "You've heard my whole sad history and given me next to nothing back. Where's your family land if you had one?" Ethan felt the question land like a stone in still water ripples spreading out in every direction he'd have to navigate carefully. "East of here," he said, which was geographically true if he stretched the meaning of east considerably. "My father built it up from nothing, passed a while back. And you didn't stay to run it." "Complicated," Ethan said, and something in his voice must have carried enough weight that Abigail, sharp as she was, chose not to push further. "Complicated, I understand," she said instead. "Lord knows nothing about this life is simple." She stood brushing crumbs from her skirt. "Come on. If Bessie's calving soon, I want the birthing stall clean and ready. Can't have new life coming into a mess." The afternoon brought its own trouble, arriving in the shape of a rider Abigail recognized, before Ethan did, a lean, weathered man on a gray mare who slowed at the gate and called out a greeting that carried genuine warmth. "That's Silas Whitfield," Abigail said, relief plain in her voice as she waved him in. "Owns the spread 2 miles south. Good man. Knew my father since before I was born." Whitfield dismounted with the ease of a man 20 years past his prime, who'd never once slowed down for it, pulling his hat off as he approached, and holding it against his chest in a gesture of respect that struck Ethan as entirely unrehearsed. Nothing like Pratt's smooth, calculated courtesies. "Abigail, honey, I am so sorry about your pa," Whitfield said, voice thick. "Should have come sooner, but we had our own trouble with the herd, and by the time I heard, it's all right, Silas, I know you would have come." "I would have." He glanced at Ethan, curiosity plain, but not unkind. "This the new hand I heard about in town?" "Ethan Walker," Abigail said. "Ethan, this is Silas Whitfield. Good neighbor, better friend." The two men shook hands. Whitfield's grip firm, and testing the particular handshake of an older rancher, sizing up a younger man's character through his palm alone. "Heard about your trouble with Pratt," Whitfield said, turning back to Abigail, his expression darkening. "Whole town's talking about it, and I heard Kane sniffing around too, which is worse trouble than Pratt by a country mile." "You know Kane?" Abigail asked. "Know of him. Broadmoor's been buying up every struggling homestead in 3 counties the past 2 years, always right after the bank puts pressure on, always at half what the land's worth. Getting so it looks less like coincidence, and more like a plan, if you ask me." Ethan went very still. "What kind of plan?" he asked, careful to keep his voice at the level of a curious hired hand, rather than a man whose instincts had just sharpened to a fine point. Whitfield shrugged, though his eyes stayed troubled. "Can't say for certain. Just seems mighty convenient that every homestead Pratt threatens to foreclose ends up with a Broadmoor offer on the table within days. Almost like the bank's tipping Kane off before the ink's even dry on the foreclosure notice." "That would be illegal," Abigail said slowly. "Wouldn't it, banker sharing private business with a buyer looking to profit off it?" "Illegal, and hard as hell to prove," Whitfield said. "Man like Pratt's careful. Keeps his hands clean on paper even if they're filthy underneath." He shook his head. I just came by to say you need anything at all, you send word. Wife's got a hen or two she can spare, and I've got hands that can help with fence or stock if this one. He nodded toward Ethan. Needs a second set. I appreciate that, Silas. Truly. And you, Whitfield said, turning to Ethan with a look that carried a quiet, unmistakable warning underneath its friendliness. You treat this girl right. Her father was the finest man I ever knew, and she's the finest thing he left behind. Anybody causes her trouble answers to half this valley hired hand or otherwise. Understood, Ethan said, and meant it with a depth that surprised even himself. Whitfield rode out a few minutes later, and Abigail watched him go with an expression that had softened considerably from the guarded wariness she'd worn around Pratt. He's right, you know, she said, about it being convenient. Pratt and Kane working the same string of homesteads. I hadn't put words to it before, but it's been eating at me since yesterday. If it's true, Ethan said carefully, that's a fraud a territorial judge would take seriously. A pattern like that proven could end Pratt's career and Kane's operation both. Abigail looked at him, something sharp and assessing in her gaze. You talk awful educated for a drifting ranch hand, Ethan Walker. His pulse jumped. My father valued schooling, he said, which was again true enough to pass. Made sure I could read contracts, understand law enough not to get cheated. Ranch hand doesn't mean ignorant. No, Abigail agreed slowly, though something in her expression suggested the explanation hadn't fully satisfied whatever instinct had prompted the question. I suppose it doesn't. The next several days folded into each other with a rhythm that felt, despite everything hanging over them, dangerously close to peaceful. They worked the herd together, mended what fence remained, hauled water from the creek during a stretch of days so dry the grass had begun to crackle underfoot by mid-afternoon. It was on one of those water-hauling trips, the two of them leading a mule loaded with barrels down toward the creek crossing, that the ground beneath them nearly took everything. The mule spooked first some rattling in the brush, a snake maybe nobody ever confirmed what, and reared hard enough to snap its lead line, sending the water barrels crashing and the animal bolting straight for the creek crossing at the exact spot where the bank had eroded thin and unstable from the drought. Ethan, the crossing's washed out there. It won't hold his weight. He was already moving, sprinting across uneven ground toward the mule, and he caught the trailing end of the lead rope just as the animal's front hooves broke through the crumbling bank edge. The mule screamed, thrashing half its body, already sliding toward the swollen creek below, and Ethan dug his boot heels into solid ground and hauled with everything 3 years of restrained, unused strength could offer. Abigail, get behind me, pull with me. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the rope behind him, both of them straining together, and for one terrible suspended moment, it seemed the mule's weight would win, would drag them both down the crumbling bank into the current. Then together they hauled the animal's front legs back onto solid ground, and with one final combined effort, the mule scrambled fully clear, trembling and wild-eyed but whole. Abigail collapsed backward into the dirt, chest heaving, and Ethan dropped down beside her, both of them staring at the spot where solid ground had very nearly betrayed them entirely. That could have been you, Abigail said, when she'd found enough breath to speak. You could have gone in the creek. It's running high and fast this time of year. You could have drowned trying to save a mule. Couldn't let him go, Ethan said. Not when I could stop it. Abigail turned to look at him, something raw and unguarded in her expression that she usually kept carefully hidden. You keep doing that, she said quietly, running toward the trouble instead of away from it. Most men I've known would have let the mule go and counted it bad luck. Most men haven't stood at your fence post and been dragged inside instead of stepped over, Ethan said. I told you, I don't forget a kindness. Whatever needs saving on this land, I intend to save it, mule or otherwise. The words carried more weight than either of them was fully prepared for, and for a long moment neither spoke. The creek rushing past below them, and the mule shaking dry a few feet away, and something passed between them, in that silence that felt for the first time entirely too large to keep pretending was simply a working arrangement between a rancher's daughter and her hired hand. We should get back, Abigail said finally, voice unsteady. Before dark. Should. Ethan agreed, and neither of them moved for another full minute. That night, over a supper made richer by a hen, Whitfield's wife had sent over. As promised, Abigail brought up the subject that had clearly been sitting heavy on her mind since the water crossing. "I went into town today before you woke," she said. "Talked to Judge Calloway's clerk about the note. About Pratt." Ethan set his fork down, attention sharp. "And clerk says there's no formal complaint on record against Pratt National, not yet, and without a formal complaint backed by evidence, there's nothing a circuit judge can act on. Whitfield's suspicion isn't proof. I'd need something concrete, records testimony, something that shows Pratt's tipping Kane off before foreclosures go public." "That's hard to get," Ethan said. "A man like Pratt doesn't leave paper trails behind for grieving widows and daughters to stumble across." "No," Abigail agreed, frustration plain in her voice. "So I'm stuck. 60 days 55 now, and no way to prove the very thing that might save this land, even if it's true." Ethan turned the problem over in his mind, and an idea began forming that he immediately recognized as dangerous, not to the plan itself, but to the careful lie he'd been maintaining since the moment he'd given her a half-true name at that fence post. Because Ethan Walker knew judges. Real judges, territorial ones, men who owed his father favors going back 2 decades. A single letter properly worded from the right name could have a formal investigation opened into Pratt National within the week. But writing that letter meant revealing exactly who he was, and he wasn't ready, not yet, not with whatever was growing between them, still so fragile and unnamed. "Maybe," he said carefully, "the answer isn't proving what Pratt's already done. Maybe it's catching him doing it again. If Kane's pattern holds, and he shows up here with another offer before the 60 days are up, that timing itself might be evidence enough for a judge willing to look." Abigail considered this, nodding slowly. That's not a bad thought, Ethan. Not bad at all." She looked at him with something like genuine respect. "You've got a sharper mind than most drifters I've met." "Comes from paying attention," Ethan said, deflecting more than he wanted to. "That's all." 5 days later, the mini-crisis Abigail had feared arrived in the form of Bessie's labor, beginning in the deep hours of night with a low, distressed lowing that pulled both of them from sleep and out to the birthing stall within minutes. "She's breech," Abigail said, hands moving fast and sure, despite the panic edging her voice. "I can feel it. The legs aren't coming right, Ethan. I need you to hold her still while I turn the calf." It was ugly, difficult work hours of it. Abigail's arm buried to the shoulder inside the straining cow, while Ethan held 200 pounds of frightened animal steady through sheer stubborn strength, both of them soaked in sweat and mud, and worse by the time the calf finally came free, slick and gasping and alive. Abigail sat back hard against the stall wall, utterly spent, watching the calf struggle up onto wobbling legs for the first time. "We did it," she said, disbelief and exhaustion and joy all tangled together in her voice. "Ethan, we did it. She's alive. They're both alive." "You did it," Ethan said. "I just held on." "You held on exactly when I needed you to," Abigail said, looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Something bright and unguarded and entirely too dangerous for either of their careful hearts. "I don't know that I could have managed that alone." "You wouldn't have had to find out," Ethan said quietly. "Not while I'm here." The words hung between them heavier than either had intended, and for a moment neither one moved, both of them kneeling in the straw and mud, exhausted past pretense, the newborn calf finding its footing a few feet away. Then Abigail laughed a real laugh, tired and full and entirely unguarded, and the moment broke into something easier, something that felt like the beginning of trust, settling into place between them, brick by careful brick. "Come on," she said, offering him a hand up. "We both smell like the inside of a barn, and I imagine we look worse. Let's get cleaned up before sunrise catches us like this." But peace on Carter Land never lasted long, and the next reminder of that arrived 3 days later in a form Ethan hadn't anticipated: Cornelius Pratt's carriage again, though this time without Kane riding alongside, and this time Pratt's smooth courtesy had thinned considerably. "Miss Carter," Pratt said, not bothering to step fully down from the carriage this time. "I've come with news I'm afraid isn't good." "You're a banker, Mr. Pratt. When has your news ever been good?" His smile flickered thin and cold. "The bank's board has reviewed your father's note and determined the original 60-day grace period was in fact an error on our part, a clerical oversight given the circumstances of your father's passing. The correct terms of the original agreement allow for only 30 days from the date of default, which places your deadline considerably sooner than previously discussed." Abigail's face went white. 30 days, you told me 60. You said 60 in this very yard not 2 weeks past." "A regrettable miscommunication," Pratt said, utterly unbothered. "The paperwork speaks for itself, and I'm afraid the paperwork is quite clear." He produced a folded document, holding it just out of her immediate reach, close enough to see, but not close enough to snatch. "You have 18 days remaining, Miss Carter. I'd encourage you to consider Mr. Kane's offer while it remains available. I understand Broadmoor is growing impatient waiting on this parcel." Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides, every instinct screaming at him to end this charade immediately, to tell Pratt exactly who was standing beside this homestead, and exactly how quickly his career would end for pulling a stunt this transparent on a grieving woman. But Abigail spoke first, her voice shaking with fury rather than fear. "That's a lie, Mr. Pratt, and you know it's a lie. You said 60 days to my face in front of witnesses." Her eyes flicked briefly to Ethan. "And I intend to hold you to your word in front of a judge if necessary." Pratt's expression cooled entirely, the last traces of false courtesy dropping away. "A hired hand's testimony against a bank's official paperwork won't carry much weight in a territorial court, Miss Carter. I'd think carefully before threatening a man who holds the note on everything you own." He rapped his cane against the carriage door, signaling the driver. 18 days. I'd use them wisely." The carriage pulled away, and Abigail stood trembling in its wake, fury and fear warring plainly across her face. "He can't do that," she said. "Can he just change the terms whenever it suits him? He shouldn't be able to," Ethan said, voice tight with barely controlled anger. "But men like Pratt count on people not having the resources to fight back. That's not law, Abigail. That's theft with a signature on it." "Then what do I do?" 18 days isn't enough time for anything not to raise the money, not to prove what he and Kane are doing, not to do a single thing except watch this land slip away exactly the way he wants it to. Ethan felt the lie in his chest, like a physical weight heavier now than it had ever been. 18 days. 18 days standing between everything Abigail's father had built and total ruin, and Ethan Walker had the power right now, this very hour, to end the entire crisis with a single ride to Millbrook and a signature of his own. But if he did that now, if he revealed everything, the money, the name, the truth buried under 3 years of careful lies, would she ever trust that anything between them had been real? Or would she look at him exactly the way she'd looked at Pratt just now? Like a man who'd used deception as a weapon against her when she was at her most vulnerable. "We'll find a way," Ethan said instead, the words tasting like ash even as he said them. "I promise you, Abigail. We will find a way through this." She looked at him, desperate and furious and utterly unaware of the truth sitting just beneath his skin, close enough to touch, close enough to save her, and still he held it back. "I hope you're right," she said quietly. "Because I don't know how many more of these carriages I can watch drive away with my whole future riding inside them." She turned and walked back toward the house, shoulders squared against a fight that had just gotten considerably harder, and Ethan stood alone in the yard, watching the dust settle where Pratt's carriage had been, feeling the 18 days ahead of him stretch out like the narrowest, most dangerous bridge he had ever been asked to cross. Behind him in the barn, the newborn calf called out for its mother, small and steady, and utterly unaware of how close everything around it had just come to falling apart. And somewhere down the valley, though, Ethan didn't yet know it, Silas Kane was already drafting a second, far more aggressive offer, one designed not to persuade Abigail Carter, but to break her. The heat broke wrong that week, not into rain, which the whole valley prayed for, but into a dry, crackling wind that swept down off the ridge and turned every blade of grass into kindling, waiting on a spark. Ethan smelled the smoke before he saw it, a bitter edge riding the wind that pulled him upright out of a half-sleep he hadn't meant to fall into. He was out of the loft and into the yard before he'd fully registered what his body already knew. Abigail! She came out onto the porch in her nightclothes, hair loose, and one look at the horizon behind him drained every bit of color from her face. To the west, where Whitfield's land bordered her own, a line of orange had begun crawling along the ridge, low and hungry, feeding on grass gone dry as paper after weeks without rain. "That's grass fire," she breathed. "That's a grass fire, and it's coming down the ridge toward the herd." "How many head are out there?" "All of them. 22 plus Bessie's calf. They're in the west pasture, Ethan right in its path." He was already moving toward the barn. "Get every wet blanket, every barrel you've got. I'll get the horses." "I'm coming with you." "Abigail." "It's my land, my herd, my father's whole life's work," she said, already pulling boots on over bare feet, voice hard as iron. "You don't get to tell me to stay behind while it burns." He didn't argue further. There wasn't time, and some part of him, the part that had spent 3 years watching a woman who calculated everything, recognized that arguing with Abigail Carter's courage was like arguing with the fire itself. Useless and a waste of precious seconds. They rode hard for the west pasture, the smoke thickening with every stride, embers beginning to drift overhead like a horrible backward snow. By the time they crested the last rise, the fire had already closed half the distance to the herd cattle bawling and scattering in blind panic, the calf Bessie's calf, not 3 weeks old, nowhere in sight. "The calf!" Abigail's voice cracked with terror. "Ethan, I don't see the calf. Bessie's here, but the calf isn't with her. Get the herd moving toward the creek, drive them east, away from the fire line. I'll find the calf." "Ethan, no, it's too close. The fire's too close." "Go, Abigail. Now." She hesitated, one agonizing second, torn between the herd and him, and then some instinct trust maybe. Though neither of them had a name yet for what had grown between them, won out, and she turned her horse hard toward the scattering cattle, shouting and driving them east. Ethan rode straight toward the smoke. He found the calf 20 yards from the advancing fire line, tangled in a fallen section of brush fence, bawling in terror, legs caught fast in a snarl of wire and branch that no amount of struggling had freed. The heat here was already fierce, the roar of the fire close enough now to feel in his chest embers landing on his shirt and singeing through before he could brush them away. "Easy," he muttered, throwing himself off the horse and down into the brush, working the wire loose with hands that shook from more than exertion. "Easy now, I've got you. Hold still." The wire gave way, just as a wall of heat rolled over the rise behind him, close enough now that he could hear individual crackling stalks of grass giving way to flame, and he scooped the calf up bodily, 40 pounds of terrified thrashing animal, and half ran, half stumbled back toward his horse. Getting the calf up and across the saddle cost him precious seconds. Seconds the fire used to close the gap even further, and by the time he'd swung up behind the animal and kicked his horse into a dead run, the flames were close enough that he felt the skin on the back of his neck tighten with the heat of it. He didn't look back until he'd cleared a full quarter-mile, and when he finally did, the entire west pasture had become a wall of orange and black smoke, the fence line he and Abigail had mended together, now nothing but ash and twisted wire. He found her at the creek, crossing the herd, bunched and lowing, but safe on the far bank, and the moment she saw him, saw the calf slung alive across his saddle, she let out a sound that was half sob, half laughter, and rode straight for him. "You found her, Ethan. You found her, I thought." Her voice broke entirely. "I thought I'd lost you both." "Wasn't going to let that happen," Ethan said, voice rough with smoke and something else entirely. "Not while I've got breath to stop it." They got the calf down and reunited with Bessie the cow, immediately fussing over her singed but otherwise unharmed baby, and for one brief moment standing in the smoke-hazed dawn, with the herd gathered safe around them, it felt like they'd won. Then Ethan turned back toward the fire, watching it crest the ridge and begin its slow, terrible march down toward the homestead itself, and understood with sick certainty that the fight had only just begun. "The house," he said. "Abigail, the wind's shifting. It's coming down toward the house." What followed was the longest hour of Abigail Carter's life, though she would later struggle to remember it in anything but fragments, hauling water in a bucket brigade that stretched from the creek to the house, soaking every blanket and quilt she owned to lay along the roof line. Ethan up on that roof with a wet burlap sack, beating out embers as fast as the wind carried them. Both of them coughing and half blind with smoke, working with a desperate, wordless coordination that felt less like two people and more like a single creature fighting for its life. "Ethan, get down, the wind's picking up. It's not safe. Almost got it, just a few more. Ethan." The shout tore out of her raw and terrified, and something in it, the particular pitch of a woman who has already lost one person she loved and cannot bear to lose another, reached him even through the roar of the fire, and he scrambled down off the roof, just as a gust of superheated wind swept a fresh line of embers across the exact spot where he'd been standing. He hit the ground hard, rolling, and Abigail was on him in an instant. Hands running over his shoulders, his face checking for burns, with a franticness that had nothing to do with hired hand concern, and everything to do with something neither of them had said out loud yet. "Are you hurt? Ethan, are you burned?" "I'm all right," he said, breathing hard, smoke blackened and singed but whole. "Abigail, I'm all right." She stared at him a long moment, and something broke loose in her face. Relief so profound it looked almost like grief. "Don't you ever do that again," she said, voice shaking. "Don't you ever scare me like that again. Do you hear me? Abigail. I mean it. I can't." She stopped herself, swallowing hard, and pressed a hand flat against his chest, as if to reassure herself his heart was still beating beneath it. "I can't lose one more person I care about. I can't." The words hung between them raw and unguarded, and Ethan understood with the particular clarity that comes only in moments of genuine danger, exactly what she'd just admitted without meaning to. There was no time to answer it. The fire was still coming close enough now that the heat of it pressed against their skin like a living thing, and beyond the ridge, the roar had grown loud enough to swallow every other sound in the world. That was when the riders came. A dozen of them, maybe more, cresting the eastern rise at a dead gallop, and at their head, unmistakable even through the smoke, rode Silas Whitfield, shouting orders to the men behind him. "Wet sacks on the south line. Cut a fire break along the fence. Don't let it jump to the barn." The whole valley, it seemed, had seen the smoke and come running neighbors. Abigail barely knew by name. Men who owed her father old debts of kindness going back decades. All of them throwing themselves into the fight, with a fury that began slowly, achingly to turn the tide. They cut a fire break wide enough to starve the flames of fuel just 20 yards from the house. They beat out embers as fast as the wind carried them. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, working shoulder to shoulder with a dozen strangers who had become in the space of one terrible hour, something like family. Ethan Walker fought for Abigail Carter's homestead, with every bit of the same desperate ferocity he would have spent defending his own. By the time the fire finally broke against the creek and began to die back into smoldering black ruin, the sun had fully risen, and the whole exhausted, soot-covered gathering stood in stunned, grateful silence, surveying a scorched pasture and a house that had, against every terrible odds, survived. It was in that exhausted aftermath, men resting on hay bales and drinking well water pulled up in buckets, that the moment came that would unravel everything. A younger rider, one of Whitfield's hands, a boy of maybe 17 who'd ridden in with the rest, approached Ethan directly, face lit with the particular excitement of someone recognizing a face they hadn't expected to see in this place. "Mr. Walker," the boy called loud enough to carry across the whole yard. "Didn't know you were out this way. My pa does hauling for your outfit, sir. Hauls timber up from the mill twice a season. Didn't recognize you at first, all covered in soot like that, but I'd know that face anywhere." The yard went very quiet. "Walker outfit," Whitfield repeated slowly, straightening from where he'd been resting against a fence post, eyes narrowing as he looked between the boy and Ethan. "You mean the Walker cattle operation? Up past Miller's Ridge." "Yes, sir," the boy said, oblivious to the sudden tension rippling through every adult around him. "Biggest spread in 3 counties. Mr. Walker, here's the owner, ain't that right, sir? My pa's hauled for your family going on 10 years now." Every eye in the yard turned to Ethan. Abigail's face, still streaked with soot and sweat from an hour of fighting for her family's survival, went through a transformation Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. Confusion first, then dawning, horrified understanding, then something that cracked straight through the center of her, like the fence post that had first brought them together. "Ethan," she said, voice very quiet, very controlled, the particular control of a person holding themselves together by sheer force of will. "What is he talking about?" Ethan opened his mouth and found that 3 years of careful preparation for exactly this moment had provided him with absolutely nothing useful to say. "Abigail," he started. "Let me explain. Is it true?" Her voice rose now, cutting clean through the murmur of the gathered neighbors. "Do you own a cattle operation, the biggest in 3 counties, this boy says? Is that true? Ethan? Is that your name at all?" "It's true," Ethan said, and the words felt like they were being torn out of him. "My name is Ethan Walker." That part was never a lie, but yes, I own the Walker Ranch. I have money, Abigail, more than you could. You let me think you were penniless. Her voice cracked entirely now, disbelief and betrayal warring plainly across her face in front of a dozen witnesses. "You let me feed you my last flour. You let me tell you about the note about Pratt, about $800 I don't have, while you had enough money sitting somewhere to end all of it with a single signature. Abigail, I can explain." "Explain what?" she demanded, stepping back from him, now putting distance between them like he'd become something dangerous. "Explain why you lied to me. Explain why you let me believe you were a starving drifter with nothing while I poured out every private grief I had to a man who was what? Testing me, studying me, like I was some kind of experiment." The word landed like a slap, and Ethan flinched because it was in its cruelest possible framing exactly what he'd done. "It wasn't like that," he said. "Not entirely. I needed to know." "Needed to know what?" Her voice had gone dangerously quiet now, more devastating than the shouting. "Whether a poor grieving woman would treat you kindly if she thought you had nothing. Was that the test?" "Ethan, did I pass?" Whitfield stepped forward, his weathered face hard, with an anger Ethan hadn't seen from him before. "Son, I don't know what game you're playing, but you've been sitting at this woman's table, sleeping in her barn, working her land under a lie, while she's been fighting for her life against men, exactly like the kind of wealth you're apparently sitting on. That's not a small thing to forgive." "I know that," Ethan said, and for the first time real desperation broke through his careful composure. "I know exactly what I've done, and I know it doesn't look like anything but cruelty right now. But Abigail," he turned back to her, and the raw plea in his voice silenced even the murmuring crowd. "Everything I felt out here was real. Every hour we spent mending that fence, pulling that calf, fighting this fire together, none of that was a lie. Only my circumstances were." "Only your circumstances," Abigail repeated, and something in her laugh was worse than tears hollow and disbelieving. "My father died 2 weeks ago, Ethan. I buried him with my own hands. And in that same breath I opened my home to a stranger because I believed foolishly that kindness given without expectation of return was worth something. You took that. You took the one pure thing I had left in the middle of the worst weeks of my life, and you turned it into a test." She stepped back further, putting the full width of the yard between them now, and around her, the gathered neighbors watched in stricken silence, none of them quite willing to intervene in a wound this raw. "I want you off my land," Abigail said, and her voice, though it shook, did not waver from the decision. "Tonight. I don't care where you go, or what fortune you go back to. I want you gone. Abigail, I trusted you." Her voice finally broke, fully tears cutting clean lines through soot on her face. "I trusted you with everything, and you let me believe a lie because you couldn't be bothered to trust me with the truth. Get off my land, Ethan Walker. Now." The yard remained silent as Ethan looked at her one long final moment, searching for any words that might undo what had just been done and finding none that could possibly be enough. "I'm sorry," he said finally quietly. "I'm more sorry than I know how to say. But I won't apologize for what I felt out here. That much was real, Abigail. Whatever else you believe about me, believe that." She said nothing. She simply turned, walked back toward her scorched, smoke-stained house, and did not look back once, as Ethan gathered what few belongings he had from the barn loft, saddled his horse, and rode out through the ruined west pasture into a morning that had promised only hours before to be the beginning of something neither of them had been brave enough yet to name. Behind him, the gathered neighbors slowly dispersed, murmuring among themselves, and Whitfield stood a long moment at the fence line, watching Ethan Walker's retreating figure with an expression that mixed anger with something like pity. Because Whitfield, old enough to have seen every kind of heartbreak this territory had to offer, recognized something in that departing rider's shoulders that Abigail, blinded by fresh betrayal, could not yet see. That was not the posture of a man who had gotten what he wanted from his test. That was the posture of a man who had just discovered in the ashes of a burned pasture and a broken trust exactly how much he stood to lose, and exactly how badly he had ruined any chance of keeping it. The ride back to Walkerland took the better part of a day, and Ethan spent every mile of it turning Abigail's words over like stones in his hands, searching for some edge he could hold on to some way the wound wasn't as final as it had felt in that smoke-stained yard. He found none. Just the plain, brutal truth that he'd built the best thing that had ever happened to him on a foundation of deception, and no amount of wealth waiting at the end of this ride could undo the moment her face had cracked open with betrayal in front of a dozen witnesses. His foreman, a broad, graying man named Dutch Malone, who'd run the operation for 15 years, met him at the gate and took one look at his employer's soot-blackened face and hollow eyes before saying a word. "Well," Dutch said slowly, "you look like a man who found what he was looking for and wishes to God he hadn't." "Something like that," Ethan said, swinging down off his horse with the stiff, exhausted movements of a man who'd fought a wildfire and lost something far more important in the same morning. "Bad. Worst thing I've ever done, Dutch. And I've done plenty." He didn't elaborate further. That first night just cleaned up, ate almost nothing, and sat alone in a study far too large and far too quiet for a single man staring at ledgers that suddenly felt obscene in their abundance when he thought of Abigail Carter facing 18 days and $800 she didn't have. It was near midnight when Dutch found him still sitting there, untouched whiskey at his elbow, staring at nothing. "You going to tell me," Dutch said, settling into the chair across the desk without invitation. "Or am I going to have to guess at whatever's eating you alive?" So Ethan told him. All of it. The fence post, the lie, the 18 days, the fire, the boy who'd recognized him at the worst possible moment, and Abigail's face as everything they'd built together turned to ash in the space of a single sentence. Dutch listened without interrupting, and when Ethan finished, he was quiet a long moment before speaking. "You love her," Dutch said. "It wasn't a question. Doesn't matter now. Matters plenty. Question is what you intend to do about it, or whether you're just going to sit here drowning in guilt while that woman loses everything her father built to a couple of thieves in fine suits." Ethan looked up sharply. "She told me to leave. Told me to stay gone." "She told you that with a fresh wound bleeding in front of half the valley," Dutch said. "Grief and betrayal make a person say plenty of things they mean in the moment and regret considering later. Question isn't what she said in that yard, Ethan. Question's what kind of man you're going to be now that you've got 18, what 17, nowadays to prove whether that lie was the whole truth of you or just the worst mistake you ever made. I can't just ride back in and hand her money, Dutch. She'll see it exactly like Cain's offer another wealthy man trying to buy his way past a problem instead of earning anything honestly. That's not what she needs from me. That's not what would fix what I broke. Then what does she need?" Ethan sat with that question a long time, and slowly out of the wreckage of that terrible day, something like a plan began to take shape. "She needs Pratt and Cain exposed," he said finally. "Proven in front of a judge as the fraud Whitfield suspects them of running. That's not charity. That's justice, and it's owed to her regardless of anything between her and me." And how do you intend to prove a conspiracy that careful men have kept off paper? Ethan's jaw set with a resolve that had been missing from his face since he rode off that fence-lined land. I know judges Dutch. I know territorial marshals. And I know exactly how to get a man like Pratt to make a mistake he can't take back. The plan took 3 days to set in motion, and every hour of it gnawed at Ethan with the awareness that Abigail's clock was running down without him there to help her face it, though he understood with a clarity that hadn't been available to him before that fire, that showing up uninvited now would only compound the damage he'd already done. He sent word instead to Judge Amos Calloway, the circuit judge who covered Millbrook and the surrounding territories, a man who had 20 years back served alongside Ethan's late father in a territorial dispute and had never forgotten the debt. The letter Ethan wrote was careful, factual, entirely without embellishment, laying out Whitfield's observed pattern of Broadmoor cattle, offers following suspiciously close behind Pratt national foreclosure threats, requesting not as a favor, but as a matter of public interest, that the judge's office look into whether a formal pattern of collusion could be established. Calloway's response came back within the week, cautious, but engaged without documented proof. Bank records showing communication between Pratt and Kane, or testimony from someone inside either operation, there was nothing yet for a court to act on. Suspicion, however well-founded, was not evidence, which meant Ethan needed evidence, and evidence meant getting closer to Pratt National than a polite letter from a distant rancher could manage. He rode into Millbrook himself 2 days later, not as Ethan Walker of the Walker cattle operation, but once again as a drifter, though this time with purpose instead of grief, driving the disguise and a folded letter of introduction from a territorial marshal tucked into his boot in case the ruse went sideways. He found what he needed in the town's one saloon, 3 days of careful listening, later in the loosened tongue of a young clerk named Willis Grant, who worked the back office of Pratt National, and had it turned out a considerable resentment toward his employer, built up over months of being asked to file paperwork that didn't sit right with his conscience. "Man makes me copy foreclosure notices before the 60 days are even up sometimes," Willis said, 3 whiskeys deep, to the sympathetic stranger who'd bought the round. Then a week later, sure as sunrise, Kane's man comes through with an offer on that exact same parcel. Never made sense to me why Pratt's got Kane's offers drafted up before the foreclosure's even final, unless Pratt's tipping him off early. Ethan finished quietly. "That's what I always figured," Willis said, nodding hard. "Ain't right, but ain't my place to say nothing. Man's got a family to feed, same as anybody." "Would you say something?" Ethan asked carefully. "If it meant stopping Pratt from doing it again? To a woman with nobody left to fight for her." Willis went quiet a long moment. The whiskey loosened warmth in his face, giving way to something more sober and considering. "Carter Place," he said finally. "That's who you're asking about, ain't it? Heard Pratt talking about that one special. Something about the water rights making it worth more to Kane than most of the parcels they've took. Would you testify to what you just told me in front of a judge? I'd lose my position. Maybe worse man like Pratt's got friends in places that matter." "I can protect you," Ethan said. "New position better pay somewhere far enough from Millbrook that Pratt's reach doesn't extend. All I need is the truth told to the right person." Willis studied him a long, careful moment, something shifting behind his eyes as he seemed for the first time to really look at the ragged stranger buying his whiskey. "Who are you, mister, really?" "Someone who owes a debt to a woman I hurt worse than I ever meant to," Ethan said. "And I intend to pay it one way or another, even if she never knows I'm the one who paid it." Judd. It took another 4 days to build the case properly. Willis Grant's testimony corroborated by ledger entries he'd quietly copied before quitting his position outright, showing a pattern of foreclosure paperwork dated days before Broadmoor cattle's corresponding purchase offers going back nearly 2 years across 11 different homesteads. 11 families. 11 homes taken not through honest failure, but through a deliberate, calculated fraud that had made Cornelius Pratt and Silas Kane wealthy off the backs of grieving, desperate people who'd had nowhere else to turn. Ethan rode the full case to Judge Calloway himself, laying it out across the judge's desk with the same careful precision he'd have used closing a cattle deal worth 10 times what was at stake here. Calloway read through every page in silence, his expression growing darker with each passing minute. And when he finally looked up, there was a hard, satisfied fury in his eyes that told Ethan everything he needed to know. "This is enough," Calloway said. "More than enough. I'll have a formal investigation opened within the week and a federal marshal riding out to freeze Pratt National's assets before he has a chance to destroy the rest of his records." He fixed Ethan with a long, assessing look. "This is thorough work, Mr. Walker. Thorough enough, I have to wonder what exactly your interest is in a struggling homestead 2 valleys over from your own operation." "Does it matter?" Ethan asked. "Not to the law," Calloway said. "But I knew your father, son, and I know grief when I see it sitting on a man's face, even when he's trying his level best to hide it behind business talk. Whatever you did to that young woman, I hope you find a way to make it right that doesn't involve you standing quietly in the shadows while she never learns who actually saved her. She doesn't want anything from me right now, Your Honor. Not my money, not my presence, not my name attached to her rescue. The least I can do is give her this without asking for anything back." Calloway studied him a long moment, something almost like respect breaking through his stern expression. "That's a rare kind of penance, Mr. Walker. Most men in your position would have ridden in with a checkbook and expected forgiveness to follow automatically. I tried honesty too late once already," Ethan said quietly. "I don't intend to make the same mistake of thinking money fixes what only time and truth can mend." Back on Carterland, the 18 days had become 11, and Abigail Carter had spent every one of them in a grinding, exhausting battle against a despair she refused to let herself fully feel. She worked from before sunrise until well past dark, mending what fence the fire had spared, tending a herd reduced further by 2 more head lost to the flames, doing the work of 2 people entirely alone because there was no one left to share the burden with. She told herself she didn't miss him. She told herself the ache that caught her at odd moments, reaching for a second cup at breakfast. Out of habit listening for footsteps in the barn loft that never came was simply the exhaustion, talking nothing more. She wasn't especially good at believing her own lies, but she practiced anyway, because the alternative was sitting with the truth that she missed Ethan Walker with an intensity that frightened her, and that missing a man who'd deceived her so completely felt like its own kind of betrayal against herself. Whitfield came by on the 9th day, his weathered face grim. "Bad news, Abigail. Pratt's filed the formal foreclosure notice. Says you've got until the 11th day from now. No extensions, no exceptions." "I know," she said, voice flat with an exhaustion that had moved past panic into something closer to grim acceptance. "I've known it was coming. Kane's man came by my place yesterday, too," Whitfield added carefully. "Made an offer on my north pasture. Same pattern as before, timed right after a bank notice went out to a struggling neighbor of mine, though I turned him down flat." "They're not going to stop," Abigail said. "Not with me, not with you, not with anybody in this valley who's got land worth taking." "No," Whitfield agreed. "Not unless somebody stops them first." She didn't ask what he meant by that. She didn't have the energy left for hope, not after the fire, not after Ethan, not after watching every possible avenue of rescue close one by one until only ruin remained on the other side of 11 remaining days. Chad, the blow that nearly broke her, came on the 7th day before the deadline, when Kane himself rode out. Not Pratt this time, but Kane directly, his flat assessing eyes carrying none of Pratt's practiced courtesy. "Miss Carter," he said, not bothering to dismount. "I understand your situation has grown considerably more urgent." "I'm aware of my own situation, Mr. Kane. I don't need you riding out here to remind me. My offer stands. $400, though I should tell you, given the circumstances, Broadmoor's willing to revise that figure downward to $350, given the fire damage to your western pasture." Abigail felt something in her chest go cold and sharp. "You're lowering your offer. After the fire nearly took everything I own." "Damaged land is worth less than undamaged land, Miss Carter. That's simple economics, not cruelty." "It's exactly cruelty," she said, voice shaking with a fury that had been building for weeks. You and Pratt have been circling this valley like vultures for 2 years, timing your offers to strike exactly when families are too broken to fight back. Whitfield told me. The whole valley knows it, even if nobody's been able to prove it yet. Something flickered behind Kane's flat eyes. Not guilt, she'd learn later, but the particular unease of a man who'd suddenly realized his careful scheme might not be as invisible as he'd assumed. "Careful, Miss Carter," Kane said, voice cooling further. "Accusations like that without proof could be taken as slander. I'd hate to see you add a lawsuit to your considerable troubles. Get off my land," Abigail said, echoing, without fully realizing it, the exact words she'd used to send Ethan away weeks before. "I'd rather lose it to foreclosure honestly than sell it to a man who profits off other people's grief." Kane's jaw tightened, and for just a moment, something almost like admiration crossed his cold expression. "Your pride's going to cost you everything, Miss Carter. 7 days. After that, this conversation won't matter, because the bank will own this land outright, and I'll buy it from them for considerably less than I'm offering you right now." He rode off without waiting for a response, and Abigail stood alone in her yard, 7 days from losing everything, feeling for the first time since her father's death like the fight had genuinely finally gone out of her. She sat down hard on the porch steps, the same steps where she'd once mended a stranger's torn shirt, and allowed herself for the first time since the fire to cry. Not quiet, controlled tears, but the full racking grief of a woman who had lost her father, her land, and a love she hadn't even let herself name before it was taken from her too. She didn't hear the rider approach until he was nearly at the gate. It wasn't Ethan. Her heart, which had leapt at the sound of hooves, sank back down when she recognized Judge Calloway's clerk instead, a nervous young man clutching a leather satchel, who dismounted with obvious relief at having found the right homestead. "Miss Carter, I've got documents here, urgent ones from Judge Calloway's office." Abigail wiped her face hastily, standing on legs that felt unsteady. "What documents?" "A federal marshal rode into Millbrook 2 days back," the clerk said, still catching his breath. "Froze every account at Pratt National. Arrested Cornelius Pratt himself on charges of fraud and conspiracy. Miss Carter, turns out there's been an investigation building for near 2 weeks now. Evidence of him working hand in hand with Broadmoor Cattle to force families off their land through falsified paperwork and altered loan terms." Abigail felt the ground shift beneath her disbelief and hope, warring so violently in her chest she could barely breathe. 2 weeks, but how? Who brought this to the judge? "That's just it, ma'am. The judge's office won't say. Whoever built the case insisted on staying anonymous, but it was thorough enough that 11 separate foreclosures are being reviewed right now, including yours. The judge is voiding the altered 30-day deadline entirely, restoring the original 60-day terms your father agreed to, and given the fraud involved. There's even talk of forgiving a portion of the outstanding note altogether, as restitution for what Pratt's scheme put your family through." Abigail sat back down hard on the porch step this time from shock rather than grief, and the clerk pressed the formal documents into her shaking hands as proof. "Kane," she managed finally. "What about Kane Broadmoor Cattle?" "Investigation's looking at them too, ma'am. Might be some time before charges are settled given how these things move, but the judge assures me your land is safe. Whatever debt remains, it's manageable, now nothing close to what you were facing before." The clerk rode off a few minutes later, leaving Abigail alone with documents that meant impossibly that everything she'd feared losing over these terrible weeks had just been pulled back from the very edge of ruin. She should have felt only relief. Instead, sitting there on the porch with salvation trembling in her hands, one single question consumed every other thought in her head. Who had built this case? Who had spent 2 weeks gathering evidence thorough enough to bring down a banker and freeze an entire cattle empire's operations? And why had they insisted on staying anonymous? She thought of Ethan immediately, and then pushed the thought away just as fast, because surely a man she'd sent away in fury and betrayal wouldn't have spent his time since fighting a battle on her behalf without a single word of explanation or expectation of thanks. Surely that wasn't the kind of man who'd lied to her at a fence post. And yet, the truth arrived indirectly 3 days later, when Willis Grant himself, the former Pratt national clerk, newly relocated and considerably better paid at a bank 2 territories over, sent a letter that found its way through Judge Calloway's careful arrangement into Abigail's hands. The letter was brief, cautious, clearly written by a man still nervous about the whole affair, but it contained one detail that undid every careful denial Abigail had been building for 3 days. A rancher, the letter said. Tall. Quiet, careful. Said his name was nothing important, but paid for my whiskey and my honesty both, and told me he owed a debt to a woman he'd hurt worse than he meant to. Never told me your name, ma'am, but the judge let slip enough for me to guess who he meant. And I thought you ought to know. Somebody fought hard for you these past weeks, even if he never once asked for credit. Abigail sat with that letter a long time, the paper trembling slightly in her hands, understanding, breaking over her slow and complete and devastating in its clarity. Ethan hadn't ridden back in with money to buy her forgiveness. He hadn't tried to fix what he'd broken with a grand self-serving gesture designed to win her back. He'd spent 2 exhausting weeks doing the hardest, most thankless kind of work, building a case, risking his own name and reputation, exposing a fraud that had nothing directly to do with winning her heart, and everything to do with simply quietly doing right by her. And he'd done it all while asking for absolutely nothing in return, not even the credit that would have made his sacrifice known. That wasn't the action of a man testing her. That was the action of a man who loved her enough to fix what he'd broken without any guarantee she'd ever forgive him for breaking it. She thought of the fence post deep enough to hold through any weather. She thought of Ethan's own words weeks ago on this same porch. A man's word ought to be like a fence post set deep enough that weather can't move it. He hadn't come back demanding forgiveness. He'd simply quietly made sure the ground beneath her stayed solid, whether or not she ever let him stand on it again. Abigail folded the letter carefully and sat a long while on the porch, watching the sun sink low over land that impossibly was still hers. Still Carter land, still standing, still whole enough to rebuild, and felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with anger anymore. She thought of Whitfield's words, the ones she hadn't let herself fully hear in the wreckage of that terrible morning. That's not the posture of a man who got what he wanted from his test. That's the posture of a man who just discovered exactly how much he stood to lose. Maybe she thought staring out at fence lines mended by hands she'd sent away in fury. Maybe grief and betrayal had made her too quick to close a door that deserved at the very least one honest conversation before it shut forever. She didn't know yet what she would say to him if their paths ever crossed again. She didn't know whether the wound of that fence post lie had healed enough to trust him fully, or whether some part of her would always flinch at the memory of learning his true name from a stranger's mouth instead of his own. But she knew, sitting there with Willis Grant's letter still warm from her hands, that the man who had ridden away from her that smoke-stained morning had not stopped fighting for her the moment she told him to leave. He had simply stopped fighting for himself and started fighting entirely and quietly for her alone. And somewhere in that terrible, complicated truth, Abigail Carter felt the first fragile stirrings of something that might, given time and honesty, enough still grow back into what they'd nearly had before the fire took it. Abigail didn't sleep that night. She sat at her father's old desk with Willis Grant's letter spread out before her, reading it over so many times the paper had begun to soften at the folds. And somewhere past midnight, she stopped asking herself whether she could forgive Ethan Walker, and started asking herself something harder. Whether she could forgive herself for the words she'd thrown at him in that smoke-stained yard. Words that had sent away a man who spent the following 2 weeks fighting, silently and without reward for her survival. She was still sitting there when dawn broke pale and gold over the scorched west pasture, and it was Whitfield's voice at her gate, urgent and low, that finally pulled her out of the chair. "Abigail, you'd best come out here." She found him standing rigid at the fence line, staring down the road with an expression she couldn't quite read, worry maybe, or something closer to disbelief. "What is it?" "Rider coming," Whitfield said. "Fast. And Abigail, I don't think it's good news." Her stomach dropped straight through the floor of her chest. She'd only just begun to let herself hope, only just begun to imagine a version of the future that included Ethan Walker in it somehow, and now dread came rushing back in to fill every space Hope had carved out overnight. The rider was Dutch Malone, Ethan's foreman, and he came into the yard at a gallop that scattered chickens and left his horse lathered and blowing hard. "Miss Carter." He swung down before the animal had fully stopped chest heaving. "I need you to come with me. Now. It's Ethan." The dread in her chest turned to ice. "What happened? Is he hurt?" Kane Dutch said the single word carrying weight enough to make her knees go weak. "Kane's men caught him on the road 2 miles east of here near the old mill crossing. Ambushed him. Must have known he was the one who brought Calloway the evidence. There's 4 of them, maybe 5, and Ethan's alone." "Alone against 5 men?" Abigail's voice came out strangled. "Why didn't he bring hands with him? Why would he ride out here alone?" "Because he was coming to see you," Dutch said simply. "Been riding this direction 3 days now, working up the nerve if I had to guess. Told me last night he couldn't wait any longer to try and make things right, whether you'd have him or not." Abigail didn't wait to hear more. She was already moving toward her horse, saddling with hands that shook from fear rather than exhaustion this time, and Whitfield was right behind her, shouting for 2 of his own hands to arm themselves and follow. "Abigail! It could be dangerous. You should let the men handle—" "He fought a wildfire to save my calf," Abigail said, voice fierce and unwavering as she swung up into the saddle. "He spent 2 weeks of his life fighting for me without asking for a single thing back. I am not sitting on this porch while 5 of Kane's men do to him what he spent his whole life trying to escape. Not for 1 more minute." They rode hard for the mill crossing, Dutch leading Whitfield, and his hands close behind, and Abigail's heart hammered with a fear that had nothing to do with land or money or foreclosure, and everything to do with the simple, terrifying realization that she loved Ethan Walker. Had loved him probably since that very first night he'd shaken while drinking water from her father's tin cup, and that love had waited far too long to be spoken aloud. They heard the fighting before they saw it. Shouts, the crack of gunfire, a horse screaming, and Abigail's blood went cold as they crested the final rise toward the mill crossing. Ethan was down off his horse back, pressed against the old mill's stone foundation, using it for cover as 3 of Kane's men closed in with pistols drawn. Blood ran from a gash along his temple, and he held nothing but a length of broken fence rail in his hands, using it to knock aside a blow aimed at his head, even as he shouted defiance at the men surrounding him. "Ethan!" Her scream tore across the clearing, and every head turned. Ethan's included his face going through shock and terror and something like desperate joy all at once at the sight of her riding hard into danger on his behalf. "Abigail, get back! Get out of here!" She didn't listen. None of them did. Whitfield's men fired warning shots into the air that scattered 2 of Kane's attackers immediately, and Dutch barreled his horse straight into the 3rd man's flank, knocking him sprawling into the dirt before he could get off another shot. The remaining assailants, outnumbered now, and clearly having expected an easy, unwitnessed ambush, rather than a small cavalry charge, broke and ran for their horses, riding hard back toward Broadmoorland, and leaving their fallen companion groaning in the dirt. Abigail was off her horse and at Ethan's side before the dust had even settled, hands running frantically over the gash at his temple, his shoulders checking for wounds, with a desperation that mirrored exactly what he'd once done for her after the fire. "You're bleeding. Ethan, you're bleeding so much. Are you shot? Tell me you're not shot." "Just the head," Ethan said, breathless, half laughing despite the pain, disbelief plain on his face. "Abigail, you came. You actually came." "Of course I came," she said, voice breaking. "Did you truly think I wouldn't?" "I thought," Ethan said slowly, "that I'd lost the right to ever expect that from you again." Abigail's hands stilled against his face, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the chaos of the fight fading around them into something that felt, despite the blood and the danger, achingly quiet. "I read Willis Grant's letter," she said finally. "I know what you did, Ethan. 2 weeks building that whole case against Pratt and Kane, never once asking for credit or thanks, never once trying to buy my forgiveness with your money." "I couldn't buy something that was never for sale," Ethan said. "I just wanted to fix what I broke, whether or not you ever let me back into your life. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, though her voice had lost all its earlier fury, carrying instead something closer to wonder. "Why keep it secret?" "Because you were right," Ethan said. "About the test. About the money being a shield I hid behind instead of trusting people with the truth. I couldn't ride back in with a grand gesture and expect that to erase what I'd done. I had to prove in some small way that I could give without needing anything back, even your forgiveness." Behind them, Whitfield's men had finished securing the fallen attacker, and Dutch approached carefully, clearing his throat. "We should get him back to the homestead, get that head wound properly cleaned. Kane's men might come back with more numbers." Abigail nodded, though she didn't release her hold on Ethan's arm, helping him up with a tenderness that spoke louder than any words could have. "Come home," she said quietly. "Let me take care of you, the way you've been taking care of everyone else without asking for anything back." Something in Ethan's face broke open at the word home, and he looked at her with an expression so raw and hopeful, it nearly undid her right there in the dust and blood of that mill crossing. "Abigail," he said carefully, "does that mean—" "It means come home," she said, cutting him off gently. "The rest we'll figure out one honest conversation at a time. No more secrets, Ethan. Not one more for either of us." "No more secrets," he agreed. "I promise you that deep as any fence post I ever set." The days that followed carried a fragile, careful tenderness neither of them rushed. Ethan's head wound healed slow but clean under Abigail's attention, and between them grew something that felt entirely different from the careful pretense of those first weeks. An honesty so complete it sometimes ached both of them, laying out every fear and hope they'd been carrying since long before that fence post ever broke. He told her everything now. About Louisa Hargrove and the broken engagement that had shattered his trust in anyone's motives. About 3 years spent believing that wealth made honest love impossible to verify, that every kindness shown to him might secretly be calculated toward his fortune rather than his heart. "I understand now," he said one evening, on that same porch where a shirt had once been mended and a fence post had once been the whole of what stood between them. "That testing you was never really about you at all. It was about me trying to protect myself from ever being fooled again, and in doing that, I nearly destroyed the one gentry thing that could have healed what Louisa broke." "I forgive you," Abigail said simply, and meant it fully without reservation. "Not because you fixed the note, or fought Kane's men, or built that case against Pratt. I forgive you because I watched you choose every single time it mattered to protect something or someone else before yourself. That's not the character of a man testing whether he could be loved. That's the character of a man who already knew how to love. He'd just forgotten he deserved it back." Ethan reached for her hand, then slow and careful, giving her every chance to pull away if she wasn't ready. And when her fingers laced through his without hesitation, something settled in his chest that had been unsettled for 3 long years. "I've got something to ask you," he said. "But I don't want to ask it here on borrowed time with everything still unsettled between Kane and the courts. I want to ask it right when there's nothing left hanging over either of us." "Then ask me when you're ready," Abigail said. "I'm not going anywhere, Ethan Walker. Not this time." Justice, when it finally arrived in full, came swift and thorough. Cornelius Pratt's trial concluded within a month, the weight of 11 separate fraud cases, and Willis Grant's detailed testimony, leaving the jury little room for doubt. He was sentenced to 8 years in territorial prison, and stripped of every banking license he'd ever held. His fine suits and rehearsed courtesies doing nothing to soften a judge who had grown over the course of the trial, thoroughly disgusted by the scale of suffering one man's greed had caused across an entire valley. Silas Kane fared no better. Broadmoor Cattle's operations were dissolved entirely once the full conspiracy came to light. Its assets seized and redistributed in restitution to the 11 families whose land had been stolen through fraud, including in a final ruling that brought Abigail to tears. When the notice arrived, full forgiveness of the remaining balance on her father's note, along with a modest sum in damages for the western pasture the fire had destroyed, while Kane's scheme was still actively terrorizing the valley. Kane himself disappeared from the territory before the marshal could serve his own charges, riding out one night and never returning. And though some worried he'd simply resurface elsewhere to run the same cruel game on some other unsuspecting valley judge Calloway, made certain his name and methods were circulated widely enough to every territorial bank and land office that Silas Kane would find no easy welcome wherever he tried next. The valley slowly began to heal. Fence lines were rebuilt, herds recovered. And on Carterland, something else began rebuilding too. Not just the scorched pasture, though, that grew green again with the first good rain of the season, but the quiet, steady trust between two people who had learned the hard way exactly what honesty was worth. It was nearly 2 months after that terrible morning at the mill crossing, when Ethan Walker rode back onto Carterland in a manner entirely unlike any of his previous arrivals. Abigail heard the carriage before she saw it. The particular sound of fine wheels on a dirt road, expensive and out of place against the modest homestead she'd spent her whole life on. And something in her chest tightened with an old familiar wariness before she remembered with a rush of warmth exactly who might be arriving in such a fashion. She stepped out onto the porch and found Ethan climbing down from a polished black carriage, dressed not in the ragged clothes he'd worn to her fence post, but in a fine coat that fit his broad shoulders, like it had been tailored precisely for him, which she'd learned it had. But it was what he carried in his hands that stopped her breath entirely. The same torn, mended shirt she'd stitched for him weeks ago, the one he'd worn as a penniless drifter folded carefully over one arm, like the most precious cargo in the world. "Ethan," she said, coming down the porch steps slowly. "What is this?" "I told you I'd ask you properly," he said, when there was nothing left hanging over either of us. "Pratt's in prison. Kane's operation is dissolved. Your note is settled, your land is safe, and there is nothing left standing between us except whatever answer you give me today." He held the mended shirt out to her, and she took it with hands that had begun unmistakably to tremble. "I wore this shirt the day I collapsed at your fence post," Ethan said. "The day you decided a stranger's life was worth saving before you knew a single thing about what he could offer you in return. I've worn fine clothes my whole life, Abigail clothes that opened doors and impressed men who wanted something from my name. But this shirt, the one you mended with your own hands out of nothing but decency, this is the only thing I've ever owned that meant anything real." He knelt then, right there in the yard, where a fence post had first broken beneath his collapsing weight, and Abigail's hand flew to her mouth as understanding broke over her, complete and overwhelming. "Abigail Carter," Ethan said, voice steady, despite the emotion thick beneath it. "I came to your land with nothing but a lie and a broken heart, and you gave me kindness anyway, because that's simply who you are, with or without an audience, with or without anything to gain. I don't have a fortune large enough to buy what you gave me that first night. I don't have words enough to properly apologize for the lie that nearly cost us everything. All I have is the truth finally, completely, and a promise that I intend to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of the trust you're choosing right now to give me again." He reached into his coat and produced a ring simple and unadorned, nothing like the ostentatious jewelry his fortune could have easily purchased. "Will you marry me? Not the rancher, not the fortune, not any name that opens doors, just Ethan, the man who fell face down at your fence post and never wanted to get back up anywhere else again." Abigail was crying now, openly, the mended shirt clutched against her chest, alongside a heart that had spent 2 months slowly, carefully learning to trust again. "Yes," she said, the word breaking loose on a sob of pure joy. "Yes, Ethan Walker, 1,000 times, yes." He rose and pulled her into his arms, and the kiss that followed carried every bit of the fear and hope and hard-won honesty that had brought them both to this exact moment, standing on land that had nearly been lost twice over, saved in the end, not by money or power, but by decency, freely given, and love, honestly earned. They married that autumn, a simple ceremony, held right there on Carter land, with Whitfield giving the bride away in place of the father she'd lost, and Dutch Malone standing as Ethan's witness with tears he didn't bother hiding. The whole valley turned out families who had watched Pratt and Kane's fraud nearly destroy them all, gathered now to celebrate a story that had, against every terrible odds, ended in justice and love rather than ruin. Abigail insisted on keeping her father's homestead exactly as it was, refusing every offer Ethan made to simply fold her modest acreage into his vast operation and erase the struggle it represented. "This land is where I learned exactly what kind of man you really are," she told him the week after their wedding, standing at the very fence post where it had all begun. "I won't erase that history for convenience, Ethan. This place stays Carter land, worked and loved exactly as my father intended, standing right alongside whatever we build together on Walker land. 2 homesteads, 2 histories, 1 family." Ethan smiled, understanding completely, and set his hand over hers on the weathered fence rail, the same rail he'd first collapsed against, now standing deep and solid, exactly the way he'd once promised her every fence he built would stand. "Deep enough to hold through any weather," he said softly, echoing words she'd spoken to him what felt like a lifetime ago. "Deep enough," Abigail agreed, "to hold through anything at all." They spent that first winter together tending both homesteads, Ethan splitting his time between the vast Walker operation and the small precious Carter land that had taught him more about genuine worth than every acre of his own fortune ever had. Bessie's calf grew strong and healthy under their combined care, and come spring Abigail discovered she was carrying a child of her own news that brought Ethan to his knees in the yard a second time, this time with joy instead of desperate proposal driving him down. Whitfield became a fixture at their table, an honorary grandfather to the growing family, and Dutch Malone eventually retired from active ranch work, to spend his final years telling anyone who'd listen the story of how his stubborn, guarded employer had ridden out looking for a simple test of human kindness, and ridden back weeks later having found something worth far more than any answer he'd originally sought. The valley itself healed alongside them, 11 families made whole again through restitution and justice. Pratt National's collapse replaced eventually by a smaller, honest bank that dealt fairly with every homestead struggling through hard seasons, exactly the way banking should have functioned all along. And on quiet evenings when the work was done and the sun sank low and gold over land that had nearly been lost to greed and was instead thriving under love. Honestly earned. Ethan would sometimes take out that same mended shirt, still kept carefully folded in a cedar chest, and remember exactly what it had cost him to learn the truth he'd spent 3 long years too afraid to trust. That genuine love asked for nothing, expected nothing, and revealed itself most clearly not in grand gestures or fine carriages, but in the quiet, steady choice to show kindness to someone who had absolutely nothing to offer in return. Abigail Carter. Walker never forgot that lesson either, and she made certain their children grew up understanding it just as deeply, that a person's worth was measured not by the wealth they carried, but by the character they showed when no one was watching, when nothing stood to be gained, when the only reward for kindness was simply the quiet knowledge of having done right by another struggling soul. The homestead thrived, the love endured, and the fence post that had first brought them together stood strong through every winter that followed, deep set and unmovable, exactly the way honest love once truly earned was always meant to last.